So we're going to look at the Civil War in this unit. Here's our essential question. And I think that there's a few things that we're going to eventually need to get to. And after we talk about the Reconstruction era, we're going to talk a lot about the lost cause. I think it's important to understand it now before we get into the Civil War, because the lost cause is a myth that comes out after the Reconstruction era ends, basically with the Southerners trying to justify why they fought the war. And there's a lot to it, and we're going to talk about it later. But one of the myths that comes out of the lost cause is this idea that slavery was going to go away anyway. So therefore, the Union, the North, the United States of America, didn't need to invade the South to end slavery. The argument is basically about how the war wasn't about slavery. It was just the North trying to oppress the South. There's a lot going on with lost cause. But the argument that slavery was dying out, that cotton production was declining, all of that's false. We can see that in this chart here. You can see in 1820, look at Alabama, 47,000 enslaved people. In 1840, that number is what? 5 times the rate, 253,000 people. And then by 1860, the year the Civil War starts, it's doubled again to 435,000. All told, there's about 4 million enslaved people in the United States at the start of the Civil War. And the chart here shows the reality of what's going on. And that's that slavery was growing, and the people that were pushing for the expansion of the enslavement system were the people that were powerful and wealthy, and the ones that really wanted to push it. And when I say wealthy, I mean very wealthy. I mean, look at this. The value of the enslaved population was worth more than all other industries in the United States combined. We talked about Lincoln's election last time. Lincoln was elected in 1860. He was elected with only Northern votes. This suggested to the South that their ability to influence politics in the Americas, in the United States, was basically gone. So they decided that the South Carolina decided it was going to secede. It's going to be followed by several other deep Southern states. They started taking over forts throughout the South. One of these forts that they did not take was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is in Charleston, South Carolina. It's in the harbor. This is a man-made island out here to protect the inlet into the state. The Union, the United States Army, still controlled Fort Sumter, and Lincoln decided that he was going to resupply Fort Sumter because they had said that their supplies were running out. And the Confederates decided that they weren't going to allow that to happen. So when the Federal ships came in to resupply Fort Sumter, the Confederates shot cannon at the United States military. This is the first shots of the Civil War. The Southerners started it. Lincoln probably planned that so that the war could start and he wouldn't be the one that started it. The Confederates are proud of this. And what this leads to is Lincoln asking for volunteers to help fight against the Confederates now that the war has started. Because of that volunteer request, some states had to decide whether or not they were going to support the Confederacy or not. These are the upper slave states and the border states. Now, this dark green area right here, these are the deep Southern states. These are the ones that seceded before Fort Sumter. These lighter green, these are what we're going to call the Upper South. The Upper South secedes from the Union after Lincoln calls for the volunteers. And then these are the border states, these kind of yellowish ones. These were slave states that remained loyal to the Union, sometimes through choice, sometimes through force. West Virginia, for example, had been part of Virginia, and it seceded from Virginia when Virginia seceded from the United States. The war is about protecting slavery. There's no two ways about it. We talked about that last time when I showed you the Declaration of Secession. So these states are important, the border states, because they were slave states that remained loyal to the Union. A lot of it has to do with the fact that they didn't have a whole lot of enslaved people in their territory. Now, Lincoln's in a tough spot. Lincoln's the president of the United States, and as president, he decides his job is to preserve the Union. Whether that means allowing slavery to exist or not, regardless of his personal feelings on it, he felt that the Union needed to be preserved. Once the war starts, Lincoln was steadfast in his belief that he needed to make sure the border states stayed in the Union. There's a number of reasons for this. One, he thought that they could lose the war if the border states left. He once said that I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky, because Kentucky was kind of a linchpin for getting troops down the Ohio River Valley and into the Mississippi. Most of the fighting of the Civil War takes place over here, kind of in the West. The battles we are all familiar with are over here in the East, but a lot of the fighting takes place in the West. So they're very strategic. He's worried about the country falling apart. And he makes this argument. And the argument about why the Southern states shouldn't secede has to do with the people. Now, he actually writes this. He gives this in the speech. They, the Confederate States, have adopted a temporary national constitution, in the preamble of which, unlike the good old one signed by Washington, they omit "we the people" and substitute "we the deputies of the sovereign and independent states." So Lincoln is going to make an argument that the Constitution is a constitution of the people, not of a collection of states. And since there was a pretty sizable pro-union group of people in the South, this isn't a unanimous decision. Not everybody in the South wanted to secede. And he says the Constitution is there to protect everybody, not just the people that have political power. And if you think about it, the enslaved people themselves wouldn't have wanted to secede because they wanted their freedom. So, excuse me, Lincoln is going to argue that the Constitution was a union of people, not a collection of states. And we can see that here, where he says the slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection, and federal government will become their enemy. That's what South Carolina says, making a states' rights argument. Lincoln, in the bottom one, says the Union is older than any of the states and, in fact, created them as states. So Lincoln is this is that argument that the war is about the people, not about individual states. Now, at some level, the Civil War is an argument about federalism. What is that balance of power between national and state governments? The conflict, the South is going to argue about states' rights and federal authority, but that's kind of lost cause afterwards as well. The one thing that the Southerners wanted was a enforcement of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. So it's kind of hard to make the states' rights argument when they were opposed to personal liberty laws that were state laws. But really, there is that conflict, but it's really about the protection of the system of enslavement and whether or not the federal government will be able to end that system of enslavement. So, as I like to say, a state's right to what, sir? Now, we can use data to predict who's going to leave. You can see here, only about, 38% of families in the South own slaves. About 75% of the population does not enslave anybody. And percentage with 20 or more slaves. The delegates to the secession convention were overrepresentative of enslavers, right? They had the political power. They were the wealthy. They had the most people enslaved. 83% of the delegates were slave owners. They're the ones that pushed for it. The South is not solid. We can also look here. The initial states to secede, all of them were 30% or above. Had populations in the slave states 30% or above. The states that remained loyal to the Union are all down here 20% or below. Now, it is true, Lincoln's initial goal was to preserve the Union. He was worried the secession would lead to the end of democracy, both in the United States and elsewhere, that this is the last best example of democracy, and if it died here, then no other country would try it. He was a free soiler. Eventually, he's going to become an abolitionist. So as a free soiler, he's not all that concerned with where slavery currently existed, but didn't want to see it expand. Now, over time, while he's in office, he is going to become an abolitionist. And he also feels bound by the presidency and the Supreme Court. Regardless of his opinions, he's not a genie that can just magically make this enslavement go away. And even if he did try to emancipate the enslaved peoples, the Supreme Court can overturn any of his executive orders. And the same people that made the Dred Scott case are the ones that are on the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roger Taney. So the war comes. Let's talk about the regional advantages. The North has more industry, has a bigger population, has more transportation, especially in railroads, is united in the sense that it has a federal government that can kind of enforce things. The Southerners have advantages as well. First of all, geography, right? They know their geography, and most of the war is going to have to be fought in the South. They can fight a defensive war, which means they don't have to attack. The North has to attack them. They should have used that same strategy that Lincoln's using during the American Revolution. I'm sorry, that Washington used in the American Revolution, which is they win by just not losing. Eventually, the North will get tired of fighting their Southern brethren, and they will just give up and go home. The district wants you to know that the South had superior military leadership. That's true at first, partially because the North had very good generals. It's just that the generals were very conservative and didn't really want to attack unless they had superior numbers. So that's true in the sense that they have people like Lee and Stonewall Jackson. As the war goes on, though, the North does get better leadership, in particular Sherman and Grant, which we'll talk about later. I think it's also important to note that superior numbers, technology, and wealth don't mean victory is assured. The British were superior in all of those aspects and lost the American Revolution. The Americans are going to be superior in all those aspects and are going to lose the Vietnam War. So there's nothing that says the United States will defeat the states in rebellion. So keep that in mind. So let's talk early about the war. The first battle is fought at Bull Run, also called Manassas, depending on which side you're looking at. It's the first real battle of the war. It doesn't go well for the Union. They thought they were going to walk all over the Southerners. The Southerners fought back, actually pushed them back, forced a retreat, and it just kind of bloodies up both sides. Nobody really wins. The Union decides on what they're going to call the Anaconda Plan. Anaconda, big snake, chokes out its victims. They're going to try to strangle out the South and hopefully end this without too much fighting. So the South doesn't really have a military, but the United States does. So they're going to use their Navy to blockade the ports out here. They're going to try to cut off the Confederacy in half right here by taking over the Mississippi River. And then they're going to try to slowly get to Richmond here. All of this is designed to choke off supplies, so it's harder for the Southerners to fight. They're going to break that idea of King Cotton, and they're going to try to starve out the South. The Confederacy, they're going to play defense. They're going to try to get Britain to become their ally and get all of their materials that way. But they just have to not lose. Early in the war, the Southerners were getting a lot of victories. The Union had a fairly poor general in General George McClellan. This is McClellan over here meeting with Lincoln. Lincoln was never all that thrilled with McClellan's efforts at fighting the war. Excuse me. He thought McClellan was too cautious, and he wanted somebody that could really go and bloody up their nose. One of the battles that McClellan does leave is the battle at Antietam. So this is about 2 years into the war. Lee had attempted to invade the North to show off just how strong the South was. I believe the story is that Lee wrapped orders around a couple of cigars, gave them to a subordinate. The subordinate was to take them to the leaders of the platoons and all that. But along the way, the cigars fell out of his pocket, and all the orders fell out of the pocket, and the Union found the orders. Whoops. The Southerners are looking for a battle at Saratoga moment, this moment where they can show the British how strong they are and get an alliance with them. It doesn't work. The Union actually wins the Battle of Antietam. It's the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Lee is forced back into the Confederacy. That stops there. Lincoln also is given a window to open this idea of Emancipation Proclamation. Confederate Army had been losing enslaved people for about a year. The enslaved people were self-emancipating. But there's no clear guidance to the United States troops on how to treat these emancipated peoples. Some of the generals decided that they should be considered as spoils of war, which means they were property that were being used against the Americans. So they shouldn't be sent back to the Confederacy because it's property that will be used against them. That term is contraband. So they are protected by the Union, but they're still considered property. Now, they do start to form communities, these self-emancipated people. They form communities. They try to support the U.S. war effort. Some of the men are even drafted to work on earthworks. They're not part of the military yet, but they are going to be used for that. So this is before the Emancipation Proclamation, and then the question becomes, well, what do we do now? So Lincoln, seeing the contraband, understanding that the enslaved people were being used against the American military, wanting to hurt the South, but also knowing that he's got an opportunity here, issues the Emancipation Proclamation as a way to try to end the war earlier. Now, two things can be true at one time. Yes, this is a military tactic. And yes, it is also a diplomatic tactic. And yes, it also shows Lincoln's evolving attitude towards the enslaved people. Just because it is true that this is a military thing done to weaken the rebel states does not mean that it's not the other two as well. Now, how is this a diplomatic document? It turns the war into a war about slavery and ending slavery. Britain had become an abolitionist country about 20 years earlier. So, by making this a war about emancipation, it means that the Confederates are obviously fighting to extend slavery. Lincoln gave the Confederates a chance to rejoin the Union as long as they gave up their slaves, and the Confederates laughed at him and said no. So it shows a lot. Here's what Frederick Douglass had to say. Basically, what he says is that Lincoln's feelings had evolved. Now, Frederick Douglass was one of the leading abolitionists of the era, and he is going to become Lincoln's champion. I'll let you read that. We're going to move on. The South disregards the Emancipation Proclamation. The border states didn't lose their enslaved states either because Lincoln was worried about turning them against him. Remember, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. But what this does is turn the United States military into an army of liberation. In fact, when the U.S. Army finally liberates Charleston, they are not playing the Star-Spangled Banner. The song they play is an abolitionist song called John Brown's Body, written after that famous abolitionist John Brown, who led the raid at Harper's Ferry. The other important thing the Emancipation Proclamation does is it allows black soldiers to officially join the U.S. military. And by the way, there was no Confederate black soldiers. Combined with the Militia Act of 1862, freedmen, black Americans, are allowed to join the Army. And they create a Bureau of Colored Troops. Obviously, the language has evolved since. And about 80% of this bureau came from southern states. For example, South Carolina has the first South Carolina Volunteers. Overall, by the end of the war, about 180,000 African Americans will serve in the war, and about 10% of all total enlisted men in the war are African American. Most famous of these is the 54th Massachusetts. The 54th Massachusetts is going to gain respect and notoriety for African-American soldiers because they're going to fight bravely at Fort Wagner. It was an all-black unit. Remember, these are all segregated units with white officers, had the worst weapons, the worst pay, the worst everything. But they're going to storm Fort Wagner and take ungodly casualties. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 60-70% casualties as they try to take this fort. Showing the bravery and ability of these soldiers. They're going to serve with distinction, and it's going to lead to more here. This, by the way, is William Carney. William Carney was the first Black Medal of Honor winner. He was from the 54th Massachusetts. And by the way, watch your sources, right? This is a picture taken from the internet. This is of the 1st Louisiana Native Guard. This is often used to show that there were Black Confederate soldiers, and that's just not true. That's a myth because this picture is actually taken from... Let's see, where is it? There we go. This is a picture that was cut out from there's a Pennsylvania division of the Union that was a black regiment, and you can see the white Union officer here. It's just they were wearing their winter white uniforms. It's not the first Louisiana natives. This is actually pro-Confederate propaganda. Oh, there it is. It's the U.S. 25th from Pennsylvania. You can also see this picture. Again, I'm kind of getting off track here, but this is Silas Chandler. Silas Chandler was an enslaved person to this person right here. I forget his name. He was also a Chandler. Silas, was this person's enslaved manservant who was taken to the Confederate lines to fight. He is not a soldier. He's not a volunteer. The reason that he didn't run away, well, one of his jobs was to actually transfer messages back and forth to the family. And this young man here, he had family back on the plantation, and if he ran away, he would never see him again. It's just an example of how emotional violence and psychological violence are part of the enslaved system. So why do people want to say that they're Black Confederates? Well, they want to say that because if there were Black volunteer enslaved soldiers, then the Civil War must not be about slavery. It must be about something else like states' rights. There were no Black Confederate soldiers. There's zero evidence that any Black Confederate soldiers were used on the battlefield. There is some evidence that about 3 weeks before the end of the war, the Confederate Congress passed a law that would allow slaves to be given to be trained to become soldiers. But early in the war, it was debated and rejected by the Confederate Congress to make Black men soldiers, because if it turned out they were good soldiers, then that meant that slavery was not justified, because citizenship is often proven by success on the battlefield. Anyways, during the Civil War, Union politics are a little tricky. The radical Republicans become the most extreme in favor of abolition. They're the ones that are going to continue on this fight for the Civil War. Southern Democrats are gone, and liberal Republicans are in charge, and they're going to want to punish the Southerners afterwards. There were a group of Democrats. Remember, the Democrats are the party of the South right now, but there's still some Democrats up north. These Democrats were referred to as Copperheads, little snakes that needed to be taken care of, because they wanted peace, even if it meant allowing the Confederacy to secede. The radical Republicans are going to win in the end, and the Copperheads are going to be shut up. But Lincoln is going to violate a number of civil liberties in order to help win the Civil War. And when I say pursuit of victory here, that doesn't mean victory on politics. That means victory in the Civil War. So he does some things like violate habeas corpus, which means he's going to throw some people in prison without having a lot of evidence because they are suspected of being spies. So there are civil liberties violations, but it's done in the need to preserve the Union. Now, this guy here, this is Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was the president of the United States. President of the Confederate States. And the Confederate Constitution pushed two new things: the idea of states' rights and the preservation of enslavement. It couldn't be banned. As such, he had a hard time getting all the states to agree on things. In fact, Texas didn't really contribute much to the war effort. And because he couldn't get all the states to agree on anything, he had a hard time uniting the country. Unlike Lincoln, who did a very good job of making sure that the Union really stayed focused. All right, some of the key battles. And you're going to want to write down the key battles here. First of all, Vicksburg. Vicksburg is this little little town on the Mississippi River. And Vicksburg was laid siege. Okay, so General Grant is the one that's in charge here. Ulysses Grant decides to lay a siege, basically not allow anything in or out of Vicksburg. There's a lot more to it, but basically that's what happens. And after about a month or two, the little town of Vicksburg runs out of food, and they surrender. What this allows is the Anaconda Plan. You can see that right here. The Mississippi River now is going to be controlled by the United States Navy and Army. They control the Atlantic Ocean. So the Anaconda Plan is really in effect. About the same day as the surrender of Vicksburg, Gettysburg happens. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania. Once again, General Lee tries to take his army and invade the north. It's the furthest north that they ever get. But at Gettysburg, it's like a 3-day battle. It's a resounding failure. The Confederate Army loses about a third to half of all of its troops, either through death, injury, or desertion. This is often considered a turning point of the war. And after Gettysburg, Lee is going to have to kind of retreat back into the South and try to regroup, which he never is able to do. After Vicksburg, General Grant is made the general of the entire army. And he changes the war strategy. He's no longer willing to wait until he has superior forces to attack. He realizes that he has more soldiers and he can replace his troops more quickly. And he is better at understanding the strategy of the overall war, linking the East and the West and all that together than his opponent. Robert E. Lee, brilliant tactician, was able to win a lot of battles, didn't really link all those things into a long-term strategy. So Grant turns this into a war of relentless pursuit. Never let the enemy take a breather, never let them catch their breath, even in the face of a defeat, which he has several defeats. And this is what earns him the nickname of a butcher. But it's not that he didn't know what he was doing. The reason that he did that was because he didn't want the Confederates to ever have a chance to regroup and recollect themselves and fight back. He could replace his soldiers faster than Lee could, and he had more resources than the rebel states, so therefore he wanted to use that to his advantage. In the Confederacy's final days, I want to mention this because the massacre of Fort Pillow is something that is really important to understand. It's not in our standards, but the Fort Pillow massacre occurs on April 12, 1864, led by the Confederate General Nathaniel Bedford Forrest. The fort was occupied by the United States Army. It was a mix of black regiments and white regiments. The fort is going to be captured by Forrest, and he will massacre all of the black soldiers. How dare they take up arms against the Confederacy? So even after they surrendered, the black soldiers were massacred in cold blood. Forrest, by the way, will go on to become the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, and there are several statues to Nathaniel Bedford Forrest around the country. So, Fort Pillow Massacre. Now, the relentless pursuit of Lee throughout the South is referred to as the Wilderness Campaign. So after Gettysburg, he retreats. Grant is turned into the leader of the Eastern Army, actually all of the army. And he's going to just start chasing Lee. Lee retreats to Petersburg, digs in, uses trench warfare. Grant lays siege there. And it's about this time that Sherman is going to start pushing into the South. Sherman is going to capture Atlanta. The capture of Atlanta shows that the Union is making progress in the Civil War. And in 1864, Abraham Lincoln defeats George McClellan, that same general from before at Antietam that Lincoln didn't like. McClellan was running on an offer of peace, that if he was elected, he would make peace with the Confederates. Lincoln, on the other hand, has Sherman's victory at Atlanta under his belt, and he's going to be reelected. Now, if you see here, this is Abraham Lincoln giving his inauguration, and this is John Wilkes Booth right here, who is going to assassinate him a few weeks later, I believe. Anyways, after Atlanta, Sherman is going to go on what's called the March to the Sea. This is total war. Now, total war in the sense that what they're doing is trying to make civilians feel the pain of the war. They're going to burn crops, destroy livestock. They're going to destroy railroad tracks. They're just going to make everything difficult for the Confederates to move supplies and make the civilians feel the pain of the war, which is going to increase desertion rates among the Confederate soldiers. Sherman and Grant would rather a soldier desert and go back home than have to shoot them on the battlefield. It also destroys railroad tracks and severed Confederate supply lines, which is important, but I think that the total warfare is more important. The district thinks that this railroad track thing is more important, though. Here's what Sherman's march was: 60-mile path of destruction from roughly Atlanta, it's right here, down to Savannah, and then up into Columbia and North Carolina. This is them bending railroad tracks. That seems important. Eventually, Lee is going to surrender to General Grant at Appomattox. Immediately, they begin crafting the memory of the war. So Robert E. Lee is going to surrender, and then he's going to start trying to tell people what the war was really about. Let's see. Oh, he comes out, they say that the North had too many resources, had too much manpower, which is not 100% true. And again, that's going to be part of that lost cause mythology. And by the way, this is what the lost cause myth making is. They're going to, the Southern sympathizers are going to say that it's not about slavery. Heavens no. And even if we did have slaves and were promoting it, they were happy anyways. They're going to say it's about Northern aggression, just like the British occupying the colonies. They're going to say it's about states' rights. States' right to what, sir? Given that, they're going to say, forget the causes. Don't think about the causes. Think about the honor and nobility of those soldiers who were fighting a war that they knew they were going to lose. And we knew that they were going to lose. So the Southerners say that they knew they were going to be crushed by the population and industrial strength of the North, but they fought anyways, which is nonsense because they saw the American Revolution and they saw how the British lost the the smaller and less technologically advanced and poorer Americans. And then they needed somebody to look to as the bright, shiny star of the Confederacy, and they make that into Robert E. Lee, the man who lost it both Antietam and Gettysburg. But he's seen as like this tactical genius, which he probably was pretty smart, but he's seen as an honorable man that hated slavery, even though he ran a plantation and was known as a pretty vicious overseer. Technically, he never owned a slave. Grant did own 2 slaves, by the way, but he emancipated them. They were gifts from his father-in-law, who was an enslaver himself. They're going to say that Lee only fought out of a duty to his home state of Virginia, even though there were other Southerners from Virginia that went to West Point that stayed loyal to the United States and actually served in the United States Army. Anyways, try not to get wrapped up in lost cause stuff and actually think through some of that. Now, this is a transformational war. Excuse me. Now, what does that mean? It means the United States was preserved. Excuse me again. The United States are kept together. Lincoln has preserved the Union. What the district wants you to know is that the supremacy of the national government was upheld. Well, sort of, for a while, until the end of Reconstruction. Then Jim Crow laws are passed, which basically is the Southerners kind of sticking their tongue out at the federal government. And the district also wants you to know that the ideas of nullification and secession were defeated, sort of, kind of, until we get into Jim Crow laws and all that. It's also the first modern war, which means it's an industrial war, that factories and machines are going to be used for that. This is going to be lessons that are going to lead to World War I. What's also important, too, is the 13th Amendment is ratified in 1865, which made slavery illegal in the United States, mostly. And it's going to preserve the gains of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it also has to sort of tie up the ends of the Dred Scott case, but that's also going to be the 14th Amendment. We'll get there.